We begin this morning by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land wherever our attendees in Australia are coming from. I'm currently on Wurundjeri Woiwurrung land in Melbourne's east. I pay my respect to elders past, present and future. I affirm that sovereignty was never ceded and that colonialism and racism continue to impact on the lives of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women and can contribute to the high rates of violence that might be experienced. I recognise the strength, resilience and leadership of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women, and I express my hope for reconciliation. I would also like to acknowledge any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. Hello, my name is Vanessa Cherniewski and I use she, her pronouns, and I am a health promotion coordinator working in the mental health priority area at Women's Health East, and I will be your host for this morning's webinar. Just before we begin, I do want to just go through a bit of housekeeping. We ask that participants remain on mute for the duration of the webinar. We do welcome conversation in the chat box, and my colleague Ada Castle will be monitoring the chat throughout the session. So please post any questions that you have throughout the webinar in the chat. We will have question time at the end of the webinar where we'll aim to answer as many questions as we can. The webinar will be recorded and will be made available after the session. The aim of today's session is to build an understanding of the impact of gender on women and girls' mental health. So we'll begin with a bit of an introduction to Women's Health East and the mental health priority area. We'll look at the current status of women and girls' mental health in Australia and the population level social determinants of mental health. We're then very privileged to have Dr Kate Johnston-Ataata from Women's Health Victoria, who will be speaking at our webinar this morning. And we're thrilled Kate could join us to talk about the myriad of ways in which gender inequality impacts on women and girls' mental health. We'll then finish the morning with a quick anonymous evaluation survey, which will be available for you to do at the end of the session via scanning the QR code, which will pop up on the screen. And we'll also put the survey link in the chat at the end of the session. And the purpose of the survey is to assess the impact and usefulness of this morning's webinar in order to shape future events. And the information you provide us really also enables us to continue to provide free and informative events for our community. So really appreciate if you're able to do that at the end of today's session. Also, just a reminder that we'll be running the second of our two-part webinar series in 2 weeks' time. So that'll be on Thursday, the 22nd of June at 10. So if you haven't registered yet, please do so. The second webinar will be looking at a gender transformative and culturally safe approach to mental health promotion. And we've got some really great speakers and case studies lined up for that session. So there's still plenty of time to register for that one. As we will be talking about mental health today, I've just got on the screen some numbers you can call in a crisis if you or someone you know needs mental health support. There's also local support services available, and Ada is going to post details of this in the chat. We'll also be touching on family violence today. So if you or someone you know needs family violence support, there are crisis numbers on the screen. If you live in Melbourne's east, the Orange Door operates in both the inner and outer areas of the east. And again, we'll also put additional contact and support info in the chat for you so that it's easily accessible. So who are we? Who are Women's Health East? We are the regional women's health promotion organisation for the East, and we're one of 12 women's health organisations across the state. We drive action to build an equitable society. Guided by evidence and informed by women's lived experiences, we strengthen the capacity of our partners and the community to improve women's health and wellbeing. Our priority areas are to advance gender equality, prevent violence against women, and improve women's sexual and reproductive health. A recent addition to our priority area is women's mental health. So our work in mental health promotion has previously been reported under the Advance in Gender Equality portfolio, and we're really pleased now to be able to have a continued focus on this important area moving forward. We know that mental health and wellbeing are essential components to overall health. The recent Royal Commission into Victoria's mental health system and the COVID-19 pandemic have drawn attention to mental health and illness, both as a serious public health issue and one that is deeply gendered. There is significant reform occurring in the mental health promotion space, and with this new and emerging developments at both the local and state level. A key opportunity included the work commissioned by the Victorian Women's Health Services sector to develop a theory of change for women's mental health promotion, addressing the social determinants of mental health. And that's the graphic you can see on the screen there. The framework sets out a theory of change for gender transformative approach to mental health promotion for women's mental health and wellbeing. So for us at Women's Health East, we see our role in this work is to work with our partners and community to build their understanding of women's mental health and the impact that gender has on their experience of mental health, and to build an understanding of gender transformative and culturally safe mental health promotion practice. There has long been a neglect of the need for gender transformative approaches to the promotion and prevention of mental health and wellbeing for the community, resulting in worsening burdens of poor mental health for women and girls. And so webinar 2 will really just address the gender transformative implementation principles that are needed to make a change in this area. We'll now just take a look at the current evidence around women and girls' mental health in Australia. We know that mental health and wellbeing is more than the absence of mental illness. It's a dynamic state of wellbeing that enables people to develop their potential, to cope with everyday stresses, to work productively and creatively, and meaningfully contribute to their communities. Almost half of the Australian population will experience a mental illness in their lifetime. Research shows that younger people have the highest rates of mental disorders across the age groups. Almost half of females aged 16 to 24 and almost 1/3 of males in the same age bracket reported a mental disorder. Research also shows that females had higher rates of mental disorders than men across every age group. Additionally, compared to men, Australian women have found to experience higher rates of anxiety and depression, higher rates of eating disorders, so 95% of hospitalizations for an eating disorder are for females, twice the rate of post-traumatic stress disorder, and higher rates of self-harm and suicidal behaviours. At least 1 in 5 pregnant women and new mothers experience perinatal anxiety and/or depression, and females represent the majority of people seeking mental health support services in Australia. Women are also more likely to experience high or very high levels of psychological distress than men. And psychological distress is defined as the non-specific symptoms of stress, anxiety, and depression. And again, we can see that a greater number of younger Australians experience high or very high levels of psychological distress, more than twice the rate of those in the older age bracket. These issues have been further highlighted during the COVID-19 pandemic as a result of the gendered expectations and the gender inequalities that shape women's lived experience. So during the pandemic, 35% of women reported psychological distress compared to 19% of men, and 37% of women aged 18 to 24 reported suicidal thoughts compared to 17% of men in that same age bracket. The impact of psychological distress from discriminatory workplace cultures, everyday forms of discrimination, sexism, gaslighting, and violence and marginalisation can cause a lack of self-worth, depression, and anxiety. In women, higher psychological distress is commonly associated with being a victim of violence or harassment and intense or prolonged periods of informal, unpaid caregiving. Research from previous disasters also suggests that inequitable outcomes among women are also likely to have been exacerbated. Mental health distress is even more severe for women who experience structural inequality and other forms of discrimination. including racism, classism, ableism, ageism, and homophobia, which in turn create social exclusion and compound mental health impacts for women in these groups. Psychological distress, self-harm and suicide rates are significantly higher for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women than for non-Indigenous women. Migrant and refugee women experience higher rates of perinatal anxiety or depression than Australian-born women, and over 60% of single mothers, who make up 80% of single parent households, nominate managing their mental health as a key challenge. While mental illness is clearly a significant public health issue, we know that these disparities aren't inevitable. Substantial evidence indicates that the prevalence of mental illness is associated with conditions arising from socioeconomic inequality and exclusion, including violence, poverty, social isolation, unemployment, and homelessness. Mental health and wellbeing are determined by multiple and interacting social, environmental, psychological, and biological factors, just as health and illness in general are determined. It's estimated that 21% of the burden of disease associated with mental health conditions is preventable, and that by acting on the key social determinants of mental health, there will be a significant decline in population-level mental illness. A social determinants approach focuses on understanding how the circumstances in which people live, work, and play shape their health outcomes. Evidence indicates that mental health promotion programs that address social connection and support, freedom from violence and discrimination, and access to economic resources are those most likely to be effective and reduce the prevalence of mental illness at a population level. So we'll just have a closer look at these three determinants. So social inclusion involves supportive relationships, involvement in community and group activities, and civic engagement. And the graphic on the screens is from the Inner East Social Inclusion Framework, which adopts the definition of social inclusion described by the Australian Social Inclusion Board. Being socially included means that people have the resources, opportunities, and capabilities they need to learn, work, engage, and have a voice in their community. Social inclusion is vital for social wellbeing and equitable health. Social support and connection are essential to mental health and wellbeing as they enable people to feel valued, loved, and cared for, to find solutions to problems, access emotional support, and validate their experiences. Everyone has the right to live free from violence and discrimination. And so violence includes physical, but also sexual, emotional, psychological, financial, technological, social, and spiritual abuse. Discriminations when a member or members of a social group are treated differently or unfairly because of membership to that group. And high levels of discrimination are associated with poorer mental health. Discriminatory attitudes and behaviour such as racism, ageism, ableism, and homophobia can in themselves be extremely harmful to mental health, and they can also play a role in driving or exacerbating violence. As well as being perpetrated by individuals, discrimination can be practiced by institutions, for example, through underrepresentation of minority members in the media, reinforcement of negative stereotypes in the reporting of conflicts involving minority groups, continuing restrictive immigration policies, limitations on access to education or employment for minority group members, and limitations on access to adequate housing, standards of health, and basic infrastructure. So economic participation includes access to work, education, appropriate housing, and financial security, and it really protects and promotes mental health and wellbeing. People experiencing low socioeconomic status have limited access to these resources, along with limited autonomy and control over life events, all of which are associated with increased risk of depression. Mental health outcomes are generally poorer among those with low education levels, low status occupations and low income, and among unemployed people or those experiencing job insecurity. Being able to access adequate financial resources is a key contributor to psychological health. So while acting on the social determinants can improve population level mental health outcomes, researchers and practitioners have also highlighted that the social determinants of mental health are deeply gendered. Gender inequality, which arises from the unequal distribution of power, resources, and opportunities among women, men, and gender diverse people, as well as persistent unfair assumptions, pressures, and treatment based on gender, negatively influence women's mental health. It also shapes women's social position, status, and treatment in society in ways that increase their exposure to conditions that contribute to poor mental health. Before I introduce our guest speaker, just a reminder that if you have any questions during the presentation, please pop them in the chat and we will address them at the end of the webinar. So on that note, I'd now like to introduce Dr. Kate Johnston-Ataata. Kate is the Manager Policy Advocacy and Health Promotion at Women's Health Victoria, where she leads the Women Health Victoria's program of work on women's mental health. Prior to joining Women's Health Victoria, Kate spent 10 years working as a researcher at RMIT and Monash universities on sociological projects exploring women's experiences of reproductive health conditions and infertility, early parenthood, and mental health. Kate is also co-director of Health Talk Australia, a public online repository of research-based health and illness narratives, and a visiting research fellow at the Social and Global Studies Centre, RMIT University. So I will now just start sharing my screen and I'll pass over to Kate.
Thanks very much, Vanessa. I'm just going to take a moment to share my screen and then we'll get started. Just hold on a second. Oh, hang on. Okay. Can everyone see that? Yes, excellent. So thanks, Vanessa, for your introduction, and to Women's Health East for inviting me to here today to talk to you about the gender determinants of women's mental health. And thanks also for that great introduction to the topic as well, Vanessa. That was really comprehensive, yeah, it'll, I think, set up us nicely to kind of go into this aspect of it a little bit more. Okay, let me see if I can move to the next screen. Okay, so I would also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that I'm on today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. And I extend that respect to any First Nations people in attendance today. I and Women's Health Victoria recognise that sovereignty has never been ceded and that we are the beneficiaries of stolen land and dispossession beginning over 230 years ago and continuing through to today. The beautiful artwork that you see on this slide was created by Madison Connors, who is a proud Yorta Yorta, Dja Dja Wurrung and Gamilaroi woman, and a member now of our Women's Health Victoria's Reconciliation Action Plan Working Group. So I'll also do a little bit of an introduction to Women's Health Victoria. For those of you who are not familiar with who we are and what we do, we're a health promotion policy, advocacy and support service. And we work across 5 priority areas. Some of them are similar to Women's Health East. So mental health, sexual and reproductive health, gender equality, prevention of violence against women, and we also have a focus on women and cancer. We run 2 direct services, the 1800 My Options Pregnancy Options Information and Support Service, and Counterpart, which is a peer support service for women with cancer. We also do workforce training and capacity building and a range of different health promotion initiatives, in addition to our research, policy and advocacy work. And this year we're celebrating our 30th birthday, which is very exciting. So on this slide, you can see our various sub-brands, and I just wanted to draw your attention to the Women's Mental Health Alliance, which is down the bottom there. So I would say that sort of mental health promotion is a new area for a number of our women's health services across Victoria. Women's Health Victoria has a slightly different sort of relationship with our mental health work, in the sense that we set up this Women's Mental Health Alliance in 2019. The impetus for that was the lack of attention that was given to gender in the Royal Commission into Victoria's mental health system. So what we did to sort of strengthen our own advocacy and policy work in this area was to kind of convene this group of 45 members now, who are a mix of people with lived experience, clinicians, researchers, service providers and other advocates. And we sort of were pushing for the interim report and the final report to have a bit more focus on gender, given it wasn't in the terms of reference. And since the report in 2021, our focus has now shifted to sort of trying to get a gender lens on the implementation of the, I think there's 74 recommendations from the Royal Commission in total, so that there's, you know, some benefit for women, girls and trans and gender diverse people. So if you'd like to learn a bit more about the Alliance and the work that we've done over the last, I think it's coming to 4 years now, you can have a look at this this link here on our website. There's quite a lot of resources and, you know, reading that you might be interested in doing. So apart from that, Women's Health Victoria also sit on a few different consultation forum bodies. So we're on the Mental Health Ministerial Advisory Committee, the Mental Health Promotion Expert Advisory Group. We're a member of Safer Care Victoria's Improving Sexual Safety in Mental Health Inpatient Units faculty. We have had sort of an evolving relationship with the statewide Women's Mental Health Service, which is a partnership between Ramsay Health, the Alfred and Goulburn Valley Mental Health Services. We were on their project working group last year for the lived experience co-design of that service, and we're now sort of engaging with them in relation to training and work capacity building for their workforce. And we've recently been invited to be on the advisory group for the statewide trauma service. We've also been involved in a range of different other consultations with other pieces of the architecture of the new mental health system. So in January this year, we published this paper that I've just put a screenshot of here. Some of you may be familiar with it, and I'll put a link to it in the chat later, but it's essentially this paper is what I'll speak to largely today, but it was born out of a sort of sense that there wasn't really a place where sort of the case, I guess, for a gender lens on mental health had really been set out, particularly for policy and practitioner workforces. So over the last couple of years, we've just sort of gathered together the evidence around, I guess, sort of the gender determinants of women's mental health, but also their experiences in the mental health system. So we published that earlier this year, and now we're working on a companion piece, which is on gender responsive mental health care. So hopefully that will be coming out later this year. So the paper sort of has 4 main parts, which are outlined here. So why a gendered approach to women's mental health is necessary, the biological and social determinants of mental health for women and girls, the influence of sex and gender on mental health diagnosis and treatment, and then sort of how gender factors into the overall mental health system. So I'll just run through this particular slide here. I won't spend much time on because Vanessa did a great job of talking us through some of these statistics. I will, however, just share this this slide here, which is taken from our Women's Health Atlas, which is another one of our Women's Health Victoria's health promotion resources. So what you've got here is those, I think they were it's the similar data that Vanessa spoke to from the census last year, but mapped by LGA across Victoria, and also with women on the left and men on the right. So I think you can sort of see that's a quite stark contrast between those rates of, this is mental health conditions rate per 10,000 people ever diagnosed in 2021. And then down the bottom, you've also got the same data mapped as a bar chart. So yeah, it's hard to sort of argue with that, which kind of begs the question of why don't we take a gendered approach to mental health, given these disparities? And as Vanessa also alluded to, taking an intersectional approach reveals that people who are from the various groups outlined on this slide have overlapping and intersecting experiences which impact their mental health quite adversely in relation to all of those forms of discrimination and prejudice that exist in our society. So looking a little bit more now at some of these biological and social determinants, some of the factors that impact are captured in this slide here. So this is taken from the paper, and it just kind of speaks, I think, to the wide variety of different influences on women's mental health. So some of these are biological. So women may experience specific mental health conditions linked to hormonal systems and their reproductive capacity throughout the life course. Those include things like premenstrual dysphoric disorder and obviously perinatal distress that might arise after having a baby or during the antenatal period as well. Then there's a whole array of social risk factors, which Vanessa spoke to, and these impact women, girls, and trans and gender diverse people at higher rates than men. So more broadly, gender inequity mean that women are more frequently subject to social risk factors than that lead to mental illness than are men. And then, of course, biological and social factors intersect. So many mental health conditions that affect women actually arise from those two things coming together. So for example, in the case of perinatal distress, you might have hormonal changes occurring in the wake of having a baby or the lead up. And at the same time, you've also got gender norms around caregiving, social isolation for new parents, lack of support for breastfeeding, things like that, which can all come together and lead to things like postnatal depression. And of course, gender influences the response that women receive from health professionals and support services, which can further compound distress and trauma. So making matters sorry, I think I was meant to leave that slide up there just before. But making things more complex, women's mental health can sort of, these factors can accumulate over the life course, and they can be at sort of take on different shades at different stages. So we know that psychological distress among young Australian women is twice that of young men. We know for around that perinatal period that, again, looking at intersectionality, migrant and refugee women experience higher rates than Australian-born women. In middle age, again, the hormonal changes that can occur with menopause can intersect with this being a time of quite high levels of caregiving and responsibility around work to produce high rates of mental distress at that stage. And I think that suicide risk is highest for women in their late 40s compared to any other time in their lives. And for older women, these factors here around economic insecurity, illness and disability, loss and grief can contribute to poor mental health at that life stage. So, violence against women, as we know, is one of the most common causes of poor mental health. In fact, the World Health Organization considers it the principal gender-related cause of mental health problems among women. And just to note that I'm currently reading for another aspect of our work, a book on women's health and ageing. And that was a study done in Australia. I think it has about 400 women, and it's a longitudinal study And they found a rate of 60% of their participants had experienced violence in some form across their lives. So it is endemic. And it's just, obviously something that we can't not consider when we're thinking about women's mental health. However, there is an under-recognition of this. So in particular, within the mental health system, using that, which tends to use that biomedical model, there is a tendency to pathologise what is actually quite a rational response to trauma, and that turns a social problem into individual dysfunction and leads to just inadequate experiences of care as well. So there's a lot more work to be done on this, and Women's Health Victoria is trying to kind of, at the moment, do some work around bringing together the different intersecting systems where women who have experienced gendered violence and are not having their trauma recovery needs met, how they interact with all of these different systems, and because of this failure sort of to recognise those impacts. So in terms of how sex and gender influence mental health diagnosis and treatment, as I've spoken about, these sort of drivers of inequality and intersectionality kind of come together over the life course, and also different points of intervention in the mental health system. And these in turn can be influenced by these building blocks, which I'll come to a little bit later. So I think this is kind of going back to the really core sort of focus of our webinar today. But these are some examples, I guess, of how gender norms, gender practices and gender structures can come together to influence women's mental health. So, for example, I'm just going to move the little speaker box here. Widespread experiences of gender discrimination and violence can intersect with the disproportionate burden of unpaid care work on women and girls, and pressures around body image. They're examples of gender norms and stereotypes that can influence mental health. Then you have gendered practices in mental health treatment that lead to practices that are quite harmful, in particular to people who've survived gendered violence. So this can manifest as denial or invalidation of people's experiences, victim blaming, misdiagnosis, use of re-traumatising coercive practices like physical restraint. And these are, as I said, all based on a poor understanding of the nature and dynamics of gendered violence among mental health professionals, and also people in other systems like the justice system. And gendered structures can be reflected in things like mental health research priorities, for example. So we know that depression is twice as prevalent among women as it is among men. However, there's much less research kind of effort and funding put into understanding this, or the sex differences. So here is another example, and I've kind of would like to acknowledge in saying this that Victoria is actually trying to address this currently through recommendation 13 of the Royal Commission. But historically we have, as a society, failed to address the lack of sexual safety in mental health inpatient units. And again, so we can kind of look at this through this three-part concept of norms, practices and structures. So it's a bit shocking to sort of hear this, but a lot of the resistance that came from mental health services was around the belief that having women in mixed gender units actually reduced male aggression. So that meant that was prioritising sort of convenience for staff over the experiences of the women in those units, and also putting economic efficiency ahead of women's safety in terms of justifying not doing anything about it on the basis of cost. Practices include, again, attitudes that don't prioritise women's safety and victim blaming. And then the structural aspect of that is not putting the resources in to prioritise women's safety, because it's just not prioritised. However, like I said, finally Victoria, after many reports, which are shown on the right there, is finally doing something about this. So then here, this is just another kind of slide which I think breaks down how gender can kind of intervene at every sort of step of the encounter or woman's encounter with the mental health system. So you'll have gender and sex-specific risk factors and symptoms not being recognised or diagnosed. Women's experiences can be minimised and symptoms dismissed, often because of a perception that suicide completion is higher among men. However, women's self-harm and attempts at suicide occur at very high rates, and often women end up dying because they're perceived as lower suicide risk than men. Diagnoses such as borderline personality disorder are quite stigmatised, and that's a diagnosis that is overwhelmingly given to women, although there is movement now to replace that with complex trauma. In terms of treatments and service models, there's over-medicalisation and people in mental health services tending to treat physical and psychological health separately. Treatments, because of that lack of research into women's, including women in medical trials, treatments are often not effective, or they have significant side effects, that limited understanding of the impact of trauma that I spoke about, and women often feeling and being unsafe in acute settings. On the part of the mental health workforce, acknowledging, of course, there are many great clinicians out there who this doesn't apply to, but research has shown, unfortunately, that stereotyped and negative attitudes towards women are quite widespread. That lack of an understanding of the impacts of gendered violence, lack of emphasis on women's mental health and medical curricula, which is obviously not limited to mental health, that's across all aspects of women's health. And then you have that underrepresentation of women at senior levels within the mental health workforce, leading to a power imbalance and further sort of disregarding of the importance of gender. So in terms of the mental health system, the paper sort of talks about 4 different domains. So policy settings, obviously we've got a very ambitious program of reform occurring currently in mental health, but we've also had a lot of reform in family violence, and in Victoria this is in gender equality as well. So those things, although they're outside of mental health, are really important in terms of those social determinants that we've spoken about. And workforce. Workforce is a tricky area because thanks to COVID, there's just been a huge, lots and lots of pressure on the mental health workforce, as it is across the whole workforce in health. But at the same time, we still have to work on some of these other areas which are around capabilities in doing gender responsive mental health care, attitudes and behaviours, and those things can't shift without system and cultural change or leadership. So that's a big area of focus for our advocacy. And then, yes, funding and research and data collection. So the workforce issues are difficult to address without improving pay and conditions. The investment that is needed into gender segregated mental health inpatient units, which is underway in addition to some of the other work that's occurring to make mixed gender wards safer. And seclusion and restraint, which we know are very particularly damaging for women and girls, often occur at higher rates when you have under-resourcing in general of your mental health service. So those things are all interrelated and need work. And yeah, we need just a huge increase in research into sex and gender in terms of how this impacts on mental health. But we also need to actually collect data too. So at the health service level as well, so that we can have a better understanding of what's happening and we can start to develop better interventions, better treatments. So in terms of mental health promotion, this is sort of revisiting, I think, a few of the points that Vanessa made, but yes, we need to address the drivers of mental ill health in women, girls, and trans and gender diverse people, and we need to take an intersectional approach. So all of those kinds of forms of discrimination and prejudice are really the foundation that, you know, so all of these kinds of areas of work that we're doing around not just gender inequality, but also around dismantling racism, ageism, homophobia, transphobia, colonisation and ableism are all going to support better mental health among women, girls and trans and gender diverse people, as well as men. Violence and then as well is obviously a huge driver. And just wanting to note that these things occur at that structural level as well as the interpersonal level. So we need to work both on our, you know, shifting attitudes and on the system change dimension. And we need to advocate for gender responsive mental health care from, you know, at all points from mental health promotion as well as early intervention through to treatment and recovery. And we need to always remember that this isn't just about, you know, sort of the traditional sort of domain of mental health or the mental health system, but we need to work with intersecting sectors such as those mentioned here. So I think I'll leave it there. There are a few sort of more slides on sort of what to do. And here, they will share these afterwards, but if you're interested, these are just a list of all of the kind of publications and webinars that the Women's Health Alliance and Women's Health Vic have done. But yeah, over now to questions.
Thanks, Kate, for that presentation. I think it really demonstrates how gender impacts on women's, I guess, experience of mental health, but also in terms of the mental health system and how the biases and stereotypes that we hold can really impact on their experiences in accessing mental health services as well. If that's okay, Kate, I'll just get you to unshare your screen. And I'm happy to, we'll see if we have any questions from the chat in a moment, but I actually just did have a question for you too. You touched on, I think, the attitudes or stereotypes that mental health practitioners might hold. And I guess I'm thinking in terms of mental health in terms of how women's experiences might be devalued or minimized. I know in terms of even like when you look at a issue like women's sexual and reproductive health, often just because of that gender bias, often their pain might be minimized or dismissed. I was wondering if, I know you touched on your presentation, if you have anything else, I guess, to say around that topic in terms of women, I guess, kind of seeking mental health support and any of those attitudes that might come into play there.
Sure. Yeah, I think that there's a long history, I think, as many people here would be familiar with, around women's sort of distress being dismissed, you know, and labels like hysteria and things like that, and women's kind of, you know, emotional kind of states being viewed through a very sexist lens to do with their kind of perceived emotional instability and things like that, which date, I think, right back to, you know, the ancient Greeks. And I think those attitudes are they can be really hard to shift. So, you know, what kind of we saw when we were looking through the research evidence and what we hear through, you know, our links on the Alliance is, yeah, just when men and women express distress, men's distress just tends to be taken more seriously by mental health practitioners, and often with women, yeah, it's still kind of a perception that they're being dramatic, or it's not real, or you know, perhaps someone might be trying to kind of you know, express some sort of traumatic experience that has occurred to them. It's just not taken seriously. And as I mentioned before as well, around when women are, at risk of self-harm or suicide, there's often just, I think mental health professionals come at it from a kind of, preconception that this is just less of a risk, that it's actually going to occur in women compared with men. So yeah, I think unfortunately it's just some of those attitudes that are just very kind of deeply embedded throughout our whole society, which you can, see outside of mental health as well. Women just being, labelled often as irrational and emotional and, not in control of their feelings and things like that. So, which is why I think, that work around attitudes is so important with mental health practitioners.
Yeah, it definitely is. I might just throw to Ada. I'm not sure, Ada, do you have any questions that have come through on the chat or to private message to you that you wanted to put to Kate?
Yeah, thanks everybody. We've got a few questions coming through, and thanks so much to the audience for putting those through to me as well. So the first question we have is that Nicole Wells from NCN Health is interested to know an estimation of how much of the data is potentially skewed by men not reporting mental health issues or reaching out for support due to stigma. And do you feel that women tend to shoulder the burden of supporting men who have mental ill health in their lives rather than having support from professionals because of this? Thanks both.
Thanks, Nicole. That's a really interesting question, the first one that you ask. I'm not sure of the answer to that. However, I think in relation to your second question, do women tend to shoulder the burden of supporting men struggling with ill health? I'm sure that is absolutely the case. It's obviously it's well known that men are more reluctant to speak up about mental health than women, particularly among their informal sort of networks, and there's often a reliance on their partner if they have one. Yeah, I'm sure that's absolutely a phenomenon, but I'm not aware of sort of research on that in terms of how it influences those overall statistics. So there's a question here from Angela. Is there a breakdown on the data for women who develop a mental health condition with those who are predisposed compared to environmentally influenced? No, not that I'm aware of. I think it's, I think with mental health, it's very difficult because so much of it is around symptomology rather than, there's no blood tests or kind of genetic conditions tests or anything at the moment for sort of mental illness. It's got a very big social component.
There's another one from Denise. Within the statistics, were numbers of women as caregivers amongst age groups considered and or collected?
I'm not sure if that's sort of like a something that is collected as a matter of course, but there's certainly quite a bit of research on caregiving and the mental health impacts of that. I think with caregiving, there's sort of like giving care in and of itself is not bad for your mental health. It's just when it's too onerous or it's not supported, by sort of structural factors and things like that. And obviously it is overwhelmingly women that do that.
Ada, was there any other questions that have come through?
Yes, thanks, Vanessa. We had another one for Kate, which was, I think that on Vanessa's slide, it said that the rates of mental health disorders decrease with age. Yet, as Kate explained, the social determinants play out in older age, e.g. economic insecurity and social isolation. Do we understand the connection between those things, i.e. why mental health disorders decrease despite those determinants? And I'll pop that in the chat as well.
Yeah, so I think with this, I don't think that older women have worse mental health than younger women. It was more noting that if older women are in a more vulnerable situation because of economic insecurity or some of those other things, it can influence, adversely influence their mental health. I think overall, there is a pickup in I think at a population level, there, for women, there is a pickup in mental health or positive mood as they get older. Often, if it's associated with a reduction in caregiving, if they have ongoing or increased caregiving responsibilities, that's less likely to be the case. So that, I guess, that underlines quite a strong connection between how burdensome caregiving is and how much of it people have to do at those ages.
Yeah, definitely.
Thanks. We actually had another question here as well,
Okay.
Which is a little bit more on Nicole's point. We'd love to hear a little bit more on the gendered norms and any intersectional impacts around help-seeking behaviours and mental health disorders underreported in different groups for different reasons, for example.
I do believe that's the case. I'm just I know I've just seen Manisha on the call. I don't know if I can put you on the spot, Manisha, if you're there, if you wanted to speak to this from a Multicultural Centre for Women's Health perspective.
And Manisha's actually, she's coming along to our second forum too, which is great.
Excellent.
As our
Excellent.
guest speaker on migrant and refugee women's mental health.
Yes. Oh, fantastic. Oh, well, yeah. Okay.
But happy to address it now.
Yes.
Manisha's happy to do that.
If not, then yeah, I guess I can just say that yeah, absolutely. There can be a lot of stigma around mental health among different, well, there is in general still, but particularly among certain population groups, which absolutely impacts on help-seeking behaviours. But on the other side of it, our mental health system is often a really unsafe place for people who are from First Nations backgrounds or culturally diverse backgrounds, etc. So it goes, I think sometimes that lack of help seeking is also based on really understandable reasons. And at MCWH are doing some really important work in their Building Bridges project, and a lot of their other work around trying to kind of understand some of that information in more detail. So yeah, come along to the second webinar.
Yes, thank you. We've just had another question in the chat from Angela. Is there more of a focus on prevention of mental health conditions for women, e.g. stress management, resilience training, mindfulness, etc.? Can you recommend any for women? And Kate, you might have something to say on this too, but I think in terms of, I guess, the prevention side, and we'll talk about this also more at the second webinar, but having that focus on, I think, interventions that are addressing more of the underlying factors that we kind of pulled out. So addressing, I guess, gender inequality and improving social connection opportunities for women, economic security, economic literacy, along with obviously violence and discrimination are the most effective. But I know that obviously there's other strategies, more of the individual level, that can help with mental health. Kate, I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that as well. And hopefully, Angela, that's what you were kind of asking.
Yeah, I guess the only thing I would just say is that I think that prevention in mental health is a really under-resourced area. Generally speaking, I think that, yeah, often it is sort of left to the individual or, small individually focused initiatives. I think there's a much bigger role for like the public, government basically to play in this area. I know, and I think that's one of the really positive things about the women's health program in Victoria now taking on mental health and wellbeing as a kind of promotion focus. And we're still building the evidence base, I think, in terms of what works and things in these areas, as well as those really big picture things around addressing gender equality and other forms of inequality and violence, etc.
Yeah, I think it is multi-level and multi-settings in terms of doing that, to see that change, definitely. Have I got any other questions that I missed? Feel free to we've still got probably about 5 or so minutes. If there's any other questions that people want to pop into the chat or to send to Ada, please feel free to do that.
We have another question here I can read out for you, panel.
Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned that violence and discrimination are a main factor at a population level that contributes to poor mental health for women. I can definitely see how microaggressions and discrimination can affect women, especially in the workplace. I was wondering how this impacts young women and girls' mental health who perhaps aren't yet in the workplace. What might microaggressions discrimination look like for them?
I think for younger women, for girls and younger women especially, I think there's a lot around that societal pressure to conform, even to things like those narrow and harmful sexualized standards that we hold, I guess, as a society, which are hard to avoid. I think they can have probably a really devastating impact on young women. So even like undermining self-concept, making them feel self-conscious, body image, and I guess eating disorders as well. So I think it is important that we maybe look at, in terms of that lifespan approach too, again, what's kind of impacting in those different age groups and how inequality really shapes how women and girls are represented and treated within society, and how that can really then have an impact on mental health as well. Kate, did you want to add anything about young women or?
Yeah, I guess that just to say that I think that in the current, context, social media plays a very big role in impacting on young women's mental health and girls, in terms of body image in particular, and sexualization and objectification, all that sort of stuff. So I think there's I have 2 teenage girls myself, so it's something that's quite close to my heart. But I think that there's a lot of work that needs to be done, probably on engaging with young girls and finding out from them what is actually behind some of the worsening statistics that we're unfortunately seeing for that cohort.
Yeah, I think there's also, especially I think in the context of COVID, there, and I've read quite a few things around young people in general, I think, in terms of feeling socially disconnected during that COVID time, especially people in that, like the young teenage years, not being able to go to school and connect with their peers, and that really having an impact on their mental health as well, like not being able to have those peer groups and like social connection opportunities as well. Like that's quite a important part, I think, of that age group as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
I think we're still starting to understand the longer term impacts of that kind of couple of years, particularly in Victoria, of being a lot of time, at home and online.
Yeah. Oh, Monisha's just posted that she'll be talking about the intersectional impact in the next webinar, and she hopes to see people there. So thanks, Monisha, and it will be great to have you present at the next webinar. We've probably got time. I don't know if there's any other questions from the audience, but we have maybe time for 1 or 2 more. If there was any others.
Sure, we've got another question.
Okay.
Rather a big question, I'm afraid, probably for its own webinar, but what about the impact of climate change on women and girls' mental health? What is the evidence there?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. and I'm not sure if Kate has some insights into that, but I think just in terms of, in general, some of the research we've done at Women's Health East and projects we've done in terms of open space and natural environments and natural public spaces, we know that like green spaces are obviously vital to mental health, and they can, you know, provide positive emotional well-being and a sense of belonging. And I also know that climate change has really come through as, I guess, an emerging issue for women's mental health, and especially for Indigenous people, for whom obviously there's acute mental health impacts of climate change. So that's definitely an emerging space, and it will be interesting to watch what comes out of that. And I guess the other side of that is that we know that climate change and environmental degradation can increase the risk of more severe, I guess, emergencies, things like COVID, and, you know, the storms that we've had up in the Yarra Ranges. That's obviously, there's also the increased risk of violence, which again has its own implications for mental health. So yeah, I mean, I don't know if Kate, if you have any more insights, but it's just, yeah, and interesting to think about that connection.
Yeah, look, I must admit it's not an area that I have much knowledge about, but you know, I think it's climate change. Well, I think we're probably all generally aware that that's become a source of anxiety for young people. So I think that it probably is. I just don't know that a lot of research has been done on this yet. I do know that a lot of the women's health services are increasingly looking at this as a bit of an area, but it's just not something that WHV works on at the moment. Yeah,
it's good to have that, a bit more of a continued focus, and to see and talk to women about their experiences of it and what, you know, impact it has on their mental health. So it's I think it's just getting more evidence around it and talking to women. We probably have time for one last question, if there is one. Ada.
Yep, there's one last one here. What can our attendees do to support an ongoing gendered understanding of mental health in their own work and workplaces following this webinar?
Come to the next one.
That's right.
Just plugging that, but I think it is, you know, it's really just, I guess the first step is looking at what we've looked at today. So looking at the status of women and girls' mental health, looking at how gender, I guess, intersects with some of those higher level determinants, and how, you know, just the context of women's lives can really impact how they experience mental health. You know, I guess in a nutshell, it does come down to gender inequality and how that kind of plays out across, you know, I guess the lifespan and across women's experience of mental health, but also with the mental health system. So the next webinar will be really beneficial to come along and look at those gender transformative mental health promotion principles, about how this work, I guess, can be done, and what that looks like for our partners and communities. So yeah, I'd encourage people to come along to that. Kate, any last?
I guess I think that from my perspective, I think it depends on what your role is and obviously what kind of work you're doing. If you're in the sort of more that prevention promotion space, it's a little bit different to those who might be working in the mental health system or, you know, other related systems. But I think that just to, you know, plug our own work, I would definitely encourage people to have a look at the paper that I put the link to and that I kind of gave a bit of an overview of today. It's much more detailed, the actual thing itself, but also on WHV's website, on that Mental Health Alliance page, there's just a real, like a wealth of, you know, reading materials and information that's all quite, you know, specific to the issues that we've spoken about today. And I think that, it's not, I guess, just wanting to underline too that it's a gendered understanding, but it's also an intersectional understanding. So just being quite conscious that any form of inequality is going to impact on people's mental health. And so, yeah, and I guess, you know, maybe perhaps moving away from that, biology has a role to play, but it's definitely much larger than that. So just keeping that in mind. And being aware, I suppose, that our current, like a lot of the discourse around mental health, you know, in wider society is very much individualised and kind of presents it as a medical condition. So just having a critical kind of perspective on that. Oh, thanks, Ada, for putting that link in.
That's probably all we actually have time for today. We're just coming to the end of the webinar. I might just share my screen because I have a evaluation survey that I would just like to get people to fill out. Just bear with me. So I've just popped up on the screen the link to the anonymous evaluation survey that would really appreciate people to fill out. So you can scan it using your phone, or Ada's going to pop a link to the survey into the chat. It's really important for Women's Health East and the Women's Health Services to get your feedback and to look at the impact that the webinar has had in terms of getting continued funding in this area, and to be able to provide free and informative webinars such as this to our community. I really wanted to say a big thank you to all of you for coming along today. It was great to see so many people interested in this topic, and for us, it's really, I guess, one of our first projects in the mental health space. So it's exciting to see there's such an interest in the region, in Victoria, and also in Australia. From here, we will be holding the second webinar in 2 weeks' time. So that's on Thursday, the 22nd of June. That one's going to be from 10 to 11:30. As previously mentioned, we will be having Monisha from the Multicultural Centre for Women's Health, and Monisha will be talking about migrant and refugee women's mental health. And we will also be having some case studies from the region to kind of just showcase some gender transformative mental health promotion work that is happening. And we'll also be looking at those gender transformative and culturally safe mental health promotion principles. So it's going to be a really exciting webinar. If you haven't already signed up, still lots of time to do that. So I would encourage you to do it. That brings us to the end of today's webinar. Again, thank you all for coming along. The recording and the PowerPoint slides will be distributed too. So if you wanted to then give it to anyone that wasn't able to come today, that would be fantastic. And again, filling out the evaluation is really beneficial for us. So thanks for coming along today, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.